The flashing red and blue lights lit up the dark street, casting eerie shadows across the trees and houses. Brandon Thompson, a 16-year-old with a shy smile and sharp mind, stood frozen, his hands raised as Officer Drew Thompson scowled at him. Brandon had just been walking home, minding his business, wearing his school backpack. But Officer Drew had decided that this kid, with his brown skin and hoodie, was up to no good. Without saying much, the officer marched right up to him and told him to empty his pockets. Confused and scared, Brandon asked what he had done, but Officer Drew was having none of it. He forced Brandon's hands behind his back, and that's when the worst happened. Out of nowhere, Officer Drew pulled out a small plastic bag filled with white powder. Holding it up in front of Brandon, he sneered, "Guess what I found in your backpack?" Brandon's heart dropped. He had never seen that bag before. "That's not mine," he said, eyes wide with panic. "I don't do drugs. I swear." But Officer Drew wasn't listening. He chuckled in a low, mean way, his eyes sharp and cold. "You think I'm gonna believe that? Tell that to the judge, kid." He snapped a picture on his phone, likely to show how dangerous Brandon looked in his black hoodie. But there was one thing Officer Drew didn't know. Brandon was the son of none other than Chief Lawrence Thompson, the head of the entire police department. Officer Drew was about to find out he just messed with the wrong kid. The night had started so ordinary for Brandon. He'd finished up late with his after-school chess club meeting, one of his favorite ways to unwind. As he packed up his chessboard and books, he noticed that everyone else had already left. The school was empty and quiet. He figured it was a good night to walk home, as he usually enjoyed the fresh air and the time to think. As he strolled down the familiar neighborhood streets, he thought about everything from his homework to his dreams of going to college. He had big plans and worked hard to make his parents proud. And being the police chief's son came with its own unique challenges. He had seen his dad fight against injustice many times, which had inspired him to work hard and stay out of trouble. But as he walked, headlights suddenly flashed behind him, and the police car crept up. At first, Brandon didn't think anything of it. Maybe the officer was just patrolling. But when the car came to a full stop, he felt a strange pang of fear. "Hey, kid," Officer Drew had called out, his voice gruff and unfriendly. Brandon paused, turning to see the officer standing beside his car, a flashlight in hand. The officer shone it directly in his face, nearly blinding him. "Come here." Brandon took a step closer, a little uneasy. "Is something wrong, officer?" "You tell me," Officer Drew replied, his gaze hard. "You look like you're up to something. Walking around here at night with that hoodie pulled over your head." Brandon's heart sank. He tried to explain himself, mentioning that he was just on his way home from school. But Officer Drew seemed to have already made up his mind about him. "Empty your pockets," the officer demanded. Brandon felt his hands tremble. He was frustrated and confused, but he complied, pulling out his phone, keys, and a few dollar bills. The officer didn't even glance at these, before moving on to his backpack. "Open it up," Officer Drew ordered, his voice full of suspicion. "Okay, but did I say you could talk?" Brandon clamped his mouth shut, feeling the weight of the officer's glare. He unzipped his bag slowly, showing the books, notebooks, and chess pieces inside. But Officer Drew seemed to be searching for something else entirely. He reached in, rummaging around as if he expected to find something illegal. And then, in one swift move, he pulled out the small bag of powder. Brandon's mind raced. How had that gotten there? He had never seen it before. He couldn't even understand why it was in his bag, but he barely had time to process before the officer was already making accusations, treating him like a criminal. "You're under arrest for possession," Officer Drew announced, pulling out a pair of handcuffs and roughly locking Brandon's hands behind his back. The cold metal bit into his wrists, and he couldn't believe what was happening. "Wait," Brandon pleaded, his voice shaking. "This is a mistake. I don't know how that got in my bag." Officer Drew only sneered, his face hard and unkind. "Tell it to someone who cares," he said. He began to drag Brandon toward the squad car, ignoring his protests. Brandon's heart pounded wildly. He didn't know how to prove he was innocent, but he knew he needed to try. As they approached the car, Officer Drew reached for his radio, smirking as he prepared to call in the arrest. But then, a new voice crackled through his radio, one that made Brandon's eyes widen with surprise and hope. "This is Chief Lawrence Thompson. All officers, respond." Officer Drew froze, his smirk fading for a moment. Brandon looked up, hope flickering in his eyes as he recognized his dad's voice coming through the radio. The officer's grip on Brandon's arm tightened, almost as if he didn't want the kid to think he was about to get off easy. But for the first time since the nightmare began, Brandon felt a small spark of relief. He knew his dad would never let something like this slide, especially if he found out his own son was involved. "Chief, this is Officer Drew Thompson," the officer said into his radio, trying to sound steady. "Just making an arrest here on a possession charge." There was a brief pause before Chief Thompson's voice came through the radio again, sounding calm but firm. "Copy that, Officer Thompson. Who's the suspect?" Brandon felt his heart hammer in his chest. He watched Officer Drew closely, wondering if the man would mention his name or keep him in the dark. Officer Drew hesitated, glancing down at Brandon, with a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. "It's a young male, about 16. Black. Says his name is Brandon Thompson." For a few seconds, there was complete silence. The radio went quiet, and Officer Drew's face paled. He didn't know yet, but Brandon could tell something was about to change. His father was the type who never showed emotion, even under pressure. But Brandon knew that the chief would not be happy to hear that his only son was being treated like a criminal. Finally, Chief Thompson's voice broke the silence, this time colder and sharper than before. "Officer Thompson, confirm. You have my son in custody?" The words hit like a lightning bolt. Officer Drew's grip slackened, and Brandon felt a strange sense of triumph watching the officer's tough demeanor crack under the chief's words. Drew fumbled for his response, his mouth opening and closing, as if he couldn't quite believe what he just heard. "Yes, Chief," Officer Drew finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. "It appears I may have detained your son." Brandon felt a surge of courage. "Yeah, and he planted drugs in my bag too," he said, looking directly into Officer Drew's stunned eyes. The officer's face reddened, and he hissed, "Keep quiet, kid." But it was too late. Chief Thompson had heard everything. "Officer Thompson," came the chief's voice, tight with anger. "Stand by. I'm on my way." Earlier that night, Brandon had thought it would be just another regular evening. After his chess club meeting, he packed up his things and waved goodbye to his friends. As he left the building, he zipped up his hoodie and popped his headphones in, listening to his favorite playlist as he started his walk home. The sky was darkening, and the cool air felt good after a long day of classes and studying. Brandon loved these walks. They gave him time to think, dream, and just enjoy the peacefulness of his neighborhood. It was a safe area, with nice neighbors and tree-lined streets. He was lucky to live here. He knew that. His dad had worked hard to give him this life. But as he turned the corner onto a quieter street, he noticed a police car parked a little further down. It wasn't unusual to see police in the area. This was a place where patrols were common, and as the police chief's son, he was familiar with most of the officers. Still, something about this car made him feel uneasy. The headlights were on, casting a blinding light his way. Before he could look away, the officer got out of the car. A tall, bulky man with a face like stone. He started walking toward Brandon, and the boy's pulse quickened. "Hey, you there!" the officer called, pointing a flashlight in his direction. Brandon froze, the light bright and disorienting. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong, but something in the officer's tone made him feel like a criminal. "Yes, officer," Brandon replied, trying to sound calm. The officer stopped just a few steps in front of him, his eyes cold and suspicious. "You live around here?" he demanded. "Yes, sir. I'm just heading home from school," Brandon explained. The officer didn't seem convinced. He scanned Brandon from head to toe, his eyes narrowing at the sight of his hoodie and backpack. Brandon could almost feel the officer making assumptions about him, assumptions he'd seen happen to other kids. He just never thought it would happen to him. "Empty your pockets," the officer ordered, not even asking why Brandon was out or offering any explanation. Brandon's stomach twisted, but he nodded and reached into his pockets, pulling out his phone, some change, and his house keys. He held them out, hoping that would be enough. But Officer Drew was just getting started. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his voice like steel. Brandon hesitated. "Just my books and chess stuff." "Open it." Reluctantly, Brandon unzipped the backpack, holding it open so the officer could see inside. Officer Drew didn't just look. He reached in, tossing things around as if he had every right to search. That's when Brandon felt a flicker of fear. This wasn't just a routine check. It felt like a setup. Finally, the officer's hand came out of the bag, clutching a small plastic bag filled with white powder. The sight made Brandon's heart stop. He didn't understand. He knew he'd never put that in his bag, but the officer looked at him with a sneer of triumph, holding up the bag as if he'd found a treasure. "Looks like we've got ourselves a drug dealer here," Officer Drew said, his voice thick with mockery. He pulled out his phone and snapped a quick picture of Brandon, who was too shocked to speak. Before he knew it, the officer had him in handcuffs, dragging him toward the squad car. Brandon tried to explain, to protest, but the officer's harsh grip and cold eyes silenced him. "You can tell it to the judge," Officer Drew had said, stuffing him into the backseat of the car. Now sitting there, Brandon felt trapped. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what he could do. He didn't know how to prove his innocence, and the officer seemed determined to make him look guilty. Just when he thought all hope was lost, his dad's voice came through the radio, filling the car with tension and a flicker of hope. Brandon barely had time to process what was happening when he saw another set of headlights approaching fast from down the street. Chief Thompson's car screeched to a halt, and he climbed out, his face a mask of controlled fury. The chief's uniform looked sharp and commanding, but his expression was anything but calm. Officer Drew opened his mouth to speak, but Chief Thompson held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Drew," he said coldly, "explain why my son is in the back of your car, in handcuffs." For a second, Officer Drew looked like a deer caught in headlights. He stammered, struggling to come up with an answer that would make sense. "Sir, I found drugs on him. He was acting suspiciously, and—" "Enough." Chief Thompson cut him off. He walked over to the squad car and opened the door, helping his son out and unlocking the handcuffs with a key from his pocket. Brandon rubbed his sore wrists, feeling his dad's reassuring hand on his shoulder. The chief turned back to Officer Drew, his gaze icy. "You planted drugs on my son." Officer Drew's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to deny it, but Chief Thompson's steely glare stopped him. It was clear he knew exactly what had happened. "Get in my office, Officer Drew," Chief Thompson ordered, his voice low but filled with authority. "You and I are going to have a long talk." As the chief led his son toward his car, Brandon looked back, seeing Officer Drew standing by his squad car, his face pale and fearful. The battle had only just begun, but Brandon knew he had his father by his side. The drive to the station was silent, heavy with tension. Brandon sat in the passenger seat, rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had dug in. His father's jaw was clenched, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn his knuckles white. Brandon had never seen his dad like this. Fierce and angry, but so quiet, like a storm brewing right beneath the surface. Chief Thompson's eyes remained fixed on the road, but finally he spoke, his voice calm but laced with fury. "Brandon, I'm sorry this happened to you. I didn't think any officer would dare try something like this, let alone one from my own department." Brandon swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what had just happened finally sink in. "I didn't even do anything, Dad. I was just walking home." His dad's eyes softened for a brief moment as he glanced at Brandon. "I know, son, but that doesn't matter to people like Officer Drew. They see skin color and make assumptions, and tonight he made the worst mistake of his career." The words hung in the air as they pulled up to the police station. As they stepped out, Brandon felt a mix of nerves and defiance. Part of him just wanted to forget about the whole thing, to pretend it hadn't happened. But another part, the part that had seen injustice too many times, wanted to make sure Officer Drew paid for what he'd done. Inside, the station was buzzing as usual, officers going about their work. But as Chief Thompson walked through, everyone quieted, noticing the tightness in his expression, the fury in his eyes. It wasn't often that they saw their chief in a rage, and some exchanged glances as he passed by, Brandon at his side. The chief led Brandon straight to his office, closing the door behind them. Sitting across the desk was Officer Drew, his face twisted in a mixture of defiance and fear. He stood as they entered, shifting nervously, but the chief held up a hand. "Sit down, officer," he commanded, his voice like ice. Officer Drew lowered himself back into the chair, his eyes darting between Brandon and Chief Thompson. "Chief, I didn't mean any harm," he began, but the chief cut him off with a glare. "Don't speak," Chief Thompson said, his voice deadly calm. "You're going to sit there and listen. Then, you're going to explain yourself." For a moment, the silence was almost unbearable. Then, in a quiet, controlled voice, the chief began. Officer Drew, you detained and handcuffed my son. You planted drugs on him, and you took a picture of him to use as evidence. Do you have any idea what you've done, or what you were risking? Officer Drew looked down, unable to meet the chief's gaze. Chief, I thought he was a suspect. He stammered, trying to defend himself. He looked suspicious, wandering around in the dark, wearing that hoodie. Chief Thompson's expression didn't change. So you assumed he was guilty based on his appearance? You assumed he was a criminal because he's black? Drew swallowed, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the right words. It's not. It wasn't like that, Chief. I just thought. You didn't think at all, Officer Drew. The chief interrupted, his voice steady and cold. You acted on your biases. You chose to harass my son, an innocent teenager, because of your prejudice. Do you realize how serious this is? Drew's face paled. Chief, please. I didn't know he was your son. If I had, I never would have. That's exactly the problem. Chief Thompson snapped, his eyes blazing with anger. This isn't about who he is to me. It's about who he is as a person, as a young man who didn't deserve this treatment. The fact that he's my son only made your actions even more reckless. Brandon watched as Officer Drew shrank back in his seat, clearly realizing just how much trouble he was in. The officer tried one last time to plead his case. Chief, I was just doing my job. Do your job? The chief echoed, his voice thick with disbelief. Your job is to protect, serve, and uphold the law with fairness. But instead, you chose to target a young man based on nothing more than your assumptions, and planted evidence to back it up. That's not just bad policing. That's a crime. The room fell silent as the weight of the chief's words settled over them. Officer Drew's face was ashen, his gaze fixed on the floor. Finally, the chief leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of disappointment. Officer Drew, you're officially suspended from duty until further notice. There will be an internal investigation, and I'm certain there will be consequences for your actions. You've not only broken the trust of this department, but also of this community. Drew opened his mouth to protest, but the chief raised a hand, silencing him. Leave, he commanded, his voice cold and final. With a resigned nod, Officer Drew got to his feet, his shoulders slumped. He left the office without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. Brandon felt a rush of relief, though a lingering anger simmered within him. Even though Officer Drew had been removed, it didn't erase what had happened. Chief Thompson let out a long sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose, as he leaned back in his chair. The lines on his face seemed deeper, as if the ordeal had aged him in just a few minutes. Dad? Brandon asked softly. What's going to happen to him? His father looked at him, his expression weary but resolute. There'll be an investigation. He'll have to answer for what he did, and if there's any justice, he'll lose his badge. Brandon nodded, though he felt a mix of emotions. He wanted Officer Drew to be punished, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unfairness that someone like Drew had even worn a badge in the first place. His dad seemed to read his mind. I know this isn't easy, son, but justice isn't always swift, and sometimes we have to wait for things to play out. I just want you to know, I'm proud of you for staying calm, for standing up for yourself. Brandon managed a small smile, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He'd been afraid his dad might be disappointed, might think he'd somehow caused all of this. But seeing the pride in his father's eyes eased some of the weight on his shoulders. Thanks, Dad, he said quietly. The chief nodded, patting Brandon's shoulder. We're going to get through this. And if there's any good that can come from this, it's that people will see how dangerous biases can be, especially in law enforcement. Just then, a knock sounded on the door, and a young officer stepped in, looking uncertain. Chief, sorry to interrupt, she said, glancing nervously at Brandon. There's a situation out front. Someone's here, and they're asking for you. Chief Thompson frowned. Who is it? The officer hesitated. It's Officer Drew's wife, sir. She's asking to speak with you. Brandon's dad shared a look with him before standing up. All right, I'll be right there, he said, glancing at Brandon. Wait here for a minute. Okay. Brandon nodded, and his dad followed the young officer out, leaving him alone in the quiet office. He sat in silence, thinking about everything that had happened and wondering what Officer Drew's wife could possibly want. Moments later, he heard raised voices from the front of the station, the sound of someone pleading, her voice tinged with desperation. Curiosity got the better of him, and Brandon moved closer to the door, straining to hear. She says she knows something. He heard his dad's voice say sharply. About her husband. Brandon's stomach twisted. What could she possibly know? Just then, the voices grew louder, and he caught a snippet of what Officer Drew's wife was saying. He told me everything. Please, you have to understand. There are more people involved. He didn't act alone. A cold chill ran down Brandon's spine. Brandon's heart pounded as he pressed his ear closer to the door, his curiosity pushing past his nervousness. He could hear his father's voice, tense and probing. Are you telling me that Drew was acting on someone else's orders? Chief Thompson's voice was low, barely controlled. Who else is involved? There was a pause, and then Officer Drew's wife, her voice quivering, replied, It's not just Drew. He's been under pressure from other officers, higher up. They've been doing this for months, targeting innocent people, planting drugs, weapons, anything to boost their arrest numbers. Brandon's breath hitched. This was bigger than he'd thought. It wasn't just one bad officer, it was a conspiracy, woven deep into the police department. Suddenly, his mind flooded with questions. How many others were caught up in this? How many innocent people had been falsely accused and sent away? Chief Thompson's voice cut through his thoughts. Do you have proof? Names? I can't investigate without hard evidence. The woman's voice cracked with desperation. I don't have everything, but I have some of the records. Drew was careless. He left notes, files. I'll give you everything I have. Just promise to keep my family safe. There was a heavy silence. Then Chief Thompson's measured response. If you're telling the truth, you have my word. No one will harm you or your children. But understand this. If what you're saying is real, I will take this all the way to the top. Brandon's heart raced. The weight of what he was overhearing settled on his shoulders, fear mixing with a strange sense of responsibility. His dad was about to go up against his own department to expose the truth, no matter how dangerous it got. He could barely move, caught between fear and the urge to do something. Anything, to help. But before he could make up his mind, the door opened, and his father stepped back into the office, closing it quickly behind him. His face was a mask of calm, but Brandon saw the storm in his eyes. Dad, Brandon whispered, what's going on? Chief Thompson exhaled slowly, as if trying to contain the tidal wave of thoughts and emotions crashing through him. He glanced at his son, his expression conflicted. Brandon, what you heard, it's bigger than you or me. There are officers out there abusing their power, hurting people like you, like so many others, and tonight we got a glimpse of it. But you're going to do something right? Brandon asked, his voice both hopeful and afraid. His dad looked at him, a fire lighting up behind his eyes. Oh, I am, but this isn't going to be easy. When I start digging into this, it's going to rattle some powerful people, and it may get dangerous. The gravity of his father's words sank in. Brandon knew his dad was no stranger to risk. But this was different. This was his own department. So what happens now? Brandon asked, feeling the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. Chief Thompson's jaw tightened. Now we prepare. I'm going to need you to stay strong and keep quiet about this. Brandon, I'll be calling in a few people I trust, people who might be able to help me investigate from the inside. But for now, we have to be careful. I can't let them know I'm onto them. The quiet determination in his father's voice made Brandon nod, even though his hands were shaking. He wasn't sure he was ready for whatever was coming, but he knew he had to be. Over the next few days, Brandon did his best to go about life as usual. School, homework, chess club, everything continued, but it felt different. The world around him seemed heavier, like it was carrying secrets. Sometimes, he'd catch himself looking over his shoulder, wondering if any of the people around him were involved, if they knew what had happened. At home, his dad was busier than ever, coming home late and leaving early, his face tense and lined with worry. Brandon's mom didn't know the details, but she knew something was wrong, and that made Brandon even more determined to help however he could. One night, as Brandon sat in his room trying to focus on his math homework, his phone buzzed. He looked down to see a text from his dad. Come downstairs. We need to talk. Brandon's stomach dropped, but he took a deep breath and made his way down to the living room. His father was there, standing by the window, his face lit only by the dim glow of the streetlight outside. He motioned for Brandon to sit down. Brandon, things are about to get more intense, he began, his tone serious but gentle. I've uncovered some names, and I've got evidence linking at least 2 high-ranking officers to this corruption. But once I file this report, they're going to know I'm coming for them." Brandon's eyes widened. "You mean, they'll try to stop you?" The chief nodded, a grim look crossing his face. "They might. But I'm ready. I just need you to understand that, for a while, things might get strange. You might hear things about me, about our family. People may even try to turn you against me or make you think I'm in the wrong. But no matter what happens, remember this: the truth will always come out in the end." Brandon felt a swell of pride mixed with fear. He nodded, trying to steady his voice. "I understand, Dad. I won't believe anything they say. I know you're doing what's right." Chief Thompson smiled, a small, weary smile. "Thank you, son. That means a lot." Before Brandon could say anything else, his father's phone rang, the harsh sound breaking the quiet. The chief answered, his face immediately darkening as he listened. "Yes, I understand. I'll be right there," he said, ending the call with a sharp click. He turned to Brandon, his expression tense. "I have to go to the station. There's been an incident." "What kind of incident?" Brandon asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. His father hesitated. "Officer Drew. He was found unconscious in his cell." Brandon's heart skipped a beat. "What? Is he okay?" The chief shook his head, a grim expression crossing his face. "I don't know, but it looks suspicious. Drew was in isolation, and the guards say they didn't see anyone go near him. They're calling it an accident, but I have my doubts." As his father grabbed his keys and headed for the door, Brandon felt a surge of dread. Everything was moving too fast, the stakes rising by the minute. He wanted to ask his dad to stay safe, to be careful, but the words caught in his throat. "Be careful, Dad," he finally whispered, just loud enough for his father to hear. Chief Thompson nodded, his eyes meeting Brandon's with a look of determination. "I will. You stay safe too, son." And with that, he was gone, leaving Brandon alone in the darkened living room, his mind racing with worry. He knew his father was brave, but he also knew how dangerous it was to go up against people who were supposed to be allies. He sat there for what felt like hours, his mind spinning with questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Who had gotten to Officer Drew? And more importantly, who would be next? The next day, rumors were already swirling around town. Whispers about Officer Drew's accident were spreading like wildfire, each story more dramatic than the last. At school, Brandon could hear kids talking about it in the hallways, teachers murmuring quietly in corners, their eyes darting around as if afraid someone might overhear. By lunchtime, Brandon was feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. He was about to head to his usual table when a familiar face appeared beside him. It was Lisa, one of his closest friends from chess club. She gave him a small, concerned smile. "Hey," she said quietly. "Are you okay? I heard about everything." Brandon forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, I'm just trying to keep my head down." Lisa nodded, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Well, if you need anything, I'm here. This whole thing sounds insane, and I just wanted you to know you're not alone." Brandon felt a rush of gratitude. In the middle of all the uncertainty, it was nice to have someone who cared. "Thanks, Lisa. That means a lot." They sat together, talking quietly, each sharing pieces of their day-to-day lives. For a brief moment, Brandon almost forgot about the chaos waiting for him outside the school walls. But that peace was shattered as soon as he walked home that afternoon. The moment he opened the door, he saw his dad's face, pale, tired, and filled with a cold fury. Something had happened. Something big. "Brandon," his dad said, his voice tight, "we need to talk. They've threatened you." Brandon's heart skipped a beat as he looked at his father. His dad's face was hard, his eyes intense in a way Brandon had never seen before. "Threatened? Me?" Brandon managed to say, his voice coming out shaky. Chief Thompson nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yes, they left an anonymous note on my desk at the station today. It had your name on it and a warning." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Brandon. Brandon unfolded it with trembling fingers, his stomach twisting as he read the words scrawled across the page. "Back off or the kid gets hurt. You've been warned." Brandon's hands started to shake as he read it over and over, the threat sinking in with a chilling clarity. Someone was watching him, and they were willing to go after him if his dad didn't back down. What are you going to do, Dad?" Brandon asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chief Thompson took a deep breath, placing a reassuring hand on Brandon's shoulder. I'm not backing down, Brandon. These people are dangerous. Yes, but that's exactly why I have to keep going. They think they can scare us into silence, but they're wrong. Brandon nodded, swallowing hard, though the fear still lingered in his chest. He trusted his dad, but the idea of someone out there watching him, willing to hurt him to protect their secrets, it was terrifying. The chief softened his expression, seeing the fear in his son's eyes. But I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Starting tonight, we're putting some safety measures in place. I've already spoken to a few officers I trust, people who know what's going on. They'll keep an eye on you and make sure you're safe at all times. Brandon nodded, a little reassured. Okay, I don't want you to get hurt either, Dad. His dad gave him a small smile. Don't worry about me, son. I've been through a lot, and I know how to handle this. The important thing is that we're prepared. That night, Brandon lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in his mind. Just days ago, life had been simple. He'd been focused on school, chess club, and maybe catching a few basketball games with his friends. But now, he was tangled up in something dangerous, something that could hurt him and the people he cared about. The next morning, his dad was waiting for him at the breakfast table, his face tired but determined. Brandon, I want you to stay close to your friends today. Don't go anywhere alone. And if you feel unsafe at any point, you call me, no matter what. Brandon nodded. Got it, Dad. As he left for school, he noticed the unmarked police car idling nearby, an officer inside giving him a quick nod. His dad wasn't taking any chances, and that gave him some comfort, even if it was a constant reminder of the danger surrounding them. At school, Brandon stayed close to Lisa and his friends, doing his best to act normal. But he felt the weight of the note everywhere he went, as if someone were watching him. He couldn't shake the feeling that every face he passed had belonged to someone who wanted to hurt him. When lunch rolled around, he sat with Lisa, who was already waiting for him with a concerned expression. How are you holding up? She asked gently. Brandon hesitated, glancing around the crowded cafeteria. It's weird, Lisa. Everything feels different. I'm always looking over my shoulder, you know. Lisa nodded, her face serious. I get it. And hey, if you ever need someone to walk with you or just be there, I'm here. You don't have to face this alone. Brandon felt a surge of gratitude. Lisa's words reminded him he wasn't in this entirely alone, even if it sometimes felt that way. Thanks, Lisa. I really appreciate it. They spent the rest of lunch talking about anything but the investigation, and for a moment, Brandon felt almost normal again. But the peace didn't last long. As he walked home that afternoon, he noticed something strange. The same unmarked car was parked nearby, but the officer was nowhere in sight. Brandon's pulse quickened, and he scanned the street, trying to spot anyone who might be watching him. Relax, Brandon, he muttered to himself, though his heart wouldn't stop pounding. He was just a few blocks from home when a black SUV pulled up beside him, its windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. The passenger side window lowered slowly, and a man leaned out. He was dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable, his eyes cold and calculating. Brandon Thompson, the man asked, his voice smooth and unfriendly. Brandon took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. Who's asking? The man's expression didn't change. Your dad's poking his nose where it doesn't belong. That could be bad for him. And for you. His voice was low, but there was a dangerous edge to it. Brandon felt his legs start to shake, but he forced himself to stand his ground. My dad's just doing his job, he replied, his voice trembling but defiant. He's not doing anything wrong. The man's lips twisted into a cruel smile. That's what you think, huh? Well, if you want to keep him safe, you'd better tell him to back off. He's in over his head, kid, and if he keeps going, well, accidents happen. Brandon's heart was racing, and he felt a wave of anger mixed with fear. You can't scare me, and you can't scare my dad either. The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold disdain. We'll see about that, he said, before the window rolled back up and the SUV sped off, leaving Brandon standing there, shaken but determined. As soon as he got home, he found his dad in the kitchen, talking to one of the officers who had been stationed outside. Brandon interrupted, his voice trembling with urgency. Dad, someone stopped me on the way home. They threatened you. Said you were in over your head. Chief Thompson's face hardened as he listened, his fists clenching. What did they look like? Brandon described the man in as much detail as he could, trying to remember every feature, every word. When he finished, his dad nodded, his expression fierce. Thank you, Brandon. I'll make sure this gets reported, and I want you to know, you did the right thing standing up to him. They're just trying to scare us because they know we're getting close to the truth. But Dad, what if they do something worse? Brandon's voice cracked, his fear creeping back in. Chief Thompson softened, pulling his son into a hug. They won't. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. And remember, we're not alone. We have good people on our side, people who believe in what's right. Brandon nodded, his dad's words comforting him even though he still felt the lingering fear. He knew his dad was brave, but he also knew the stakes were high. And as much as he tried to be strong, part of him couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was closing in faster than they could prepare for. The next morning, Chief Thompson received a call that jolted him out of bed before the sun had even risen. A serious incident had occurred overnight, involving one of the officers he trusted with information about the case. Officer Hart had been found unconscious in his patrol car, the windows shattered, his radio smashed. At the scene, the officer in charge reported finding a note pinned to the steering wheel with a knife. It read, "Stay out of this, or more will follow." Chief Thompson's mind raced as he read the note, dread settling over him. The people they were up against were more ruthless than he'd expected. And now, they weren't just threatening him. They were willing to hurt anyone close to him who got in their way. As he returned home, he found Brandon waiting, his face pale. He'd seen the report on the news about the mysterious assault on Officer Hart and connected the dots immediately. "Dad," Brandon said quietly, "are you still going to keep going?" Chief Thompson didn't hesitate. "Yes, I am, and I need you to know something, son. What we're doing is dangerous, but it's also necessary. Because if we back down now, people like that man who threatened you, people who abuse their power, will keep getting away with it." Brandon took a deep breath, his heart pounding, but his resolve steady. "Then I'll be ready to." Just then, the phone rang, and Chief Thompson picked it up, his face growing grim as he listened. He ended the call and turned to Brandon, his voice filled with urgency. "They've called an emergency meeting at the station," he said, grabbing his jacket. "Stay here and stay safe. I'll be back soon." Brandon nodded, watching his father leave with a sinking feeling. He wanted to believe everything would be fine. But as the door closed, he couldn't shake the sense that things were only about to get more dangerous. And he was right. Brandon paced around the house after his dad left, 1,000 thoughts running through his mind. His father had been gone for only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. He tried watching TV, then attempted to do his homework, but nothing could distract him from the worry gnawing at his stomach. Just as he was about to call his dad to check in, he heard a noise outside. He peered through the living room window and saw a black SUV parked across the street. His heart skipped a beat. It looked just like the one the man had driven yesterday. He quickly ducked back, breathing hard. They were watching him again. The phone rang, and he jumped, startled. It wasn't his dad's number. It was an unknown caller. Hesitantly, he picked up, his heart pounding. "Hello." A low, calm voice came over the line. "Brandon Thompson. I see you're home alone." Brandon froze, gripping the phone tightly. "Who is this?" "That's not important. What's important is that your father has a choice to make, and he better make it soon. You see, there's a reason people stay silent, Brandon. There are consequences for getting too involved. I'd hate to see those consequences reach you." Brandon felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to hang up, but he couldn't bring himself to move. "Tell your dad that if he knows what's good for him, he'll drop this investigation. Otherwise, well, you don't want to find out, do you?" The line clicked, leaving Brandon in the silence of the living room, his mind reeling. He knew he needed to tell his dad about this immediately. He grabbed his phone and sent a text to his father. "Someone just called me, Dad. They threatened me again, said you have a choice to make." Seconds later, his dad responded, "Stay calm, Brandon. I'm on my way." Chief Thompson arrived home in record time, his face set in a mask of calm determination. But Brandon could tell by the tension in his father's jaw that he was furious. "Did you recognize the voice?" his dad asked, sitting across from him, his gaze intense. Brandon shook his head. "No, it was just cold, like they knew exactly how to get to me." His dad put a hand on his shoulder. "Brandon, I want you to know that none of this is your fault. They're trying to scare you because they know they're losing control. And that's why I can't stop. Not now. They're getting desperate. And when people like that start to feel cornered, they make mistakes. Brandon nodded, feeling a little better. So, what do we do now? Chief Thompson glanced out the window at the black SUV, still parked across the street, and his expression hardened. First, we make sure you're safe. I've arranged for you to stay with your Aunt Sarah out of town for a few days. You'll be off their radar, and I'll have some time to act without them using you against me. Brandon opened his mouth to protest, but his dad cut him off. This isn't up for debate, son. They know where you live, and I'm not taking any chances. I need to know you're safe. With a heavy heart, Brandon nodded. He didn't want to leave, but he knew his dad was right. The threats had gotten serious, and he didn't want to make things harder for his father. But deep down, he felt a pang of guilt. If he left, it would mean his dad was standing up to these people alone. The next morning, Brandon packed his bags, his emotions a jumble of fear, worry, and sadness. He hugged his dad tightly before getting into the car with Officer Ramirez, a trusted family friend who had agreed to drive him to Aunt Sarah's house. His dad watched them pull away, a look of fierce determination in his eyes. As they drove through town, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Every car they passed, every dark window he glimpsed seemed to hold a hidden threat. But Officer Ramirez was calm and reassuring, making small talk to keep Brandon's mind off the fear. They'd been on the road for about an hour when Officer Ramirez's radio crackled with a report. All units, possible break-in at 451 Maple Street. Suspected connection to recent threats against law enforcement. Brandon's ears perked up at the address. It was his house. Officer Ramirez shot him a worried glance. Brandon, don't worry. Your dad's probably already handling it. They're just trying to intimidate him. Brandon swallowed hard, his mind racing. Whoever had called him last night was making good on their threats. But he trusted his dad. He knew he could handle himself. He sat back, forcing himself to breathe, trying to ignore the growing fear gnawing at him. Meanwhile, back in town, Chief Thompson was indeed handling it. As he arrived at the house, he found the front door ajar, a clear message left behind. He entered carefully, his hand resting on his holstered gun as he surveyed the scene. The living room was untouched, but a closer inspection revealed a small, deliberate mess in Brandon's room. Papers scattered, drawers open. It was just enough to send a message. We can reach your family. Chief Thompson's jaw clenched, his anger growing. He had anticipated some pushback, but the lengths these people were willing to go were far more personal than he'd imagined. He snapped a picture of the scene with his phone, documenting the intrusion, and called it in. As he hung up, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Taped to the underside of Brandon's desk was a small packet of white powder, a tactic he'd seen used before. A gift from officers looking to stage arrests. Chief Thompson's hands shook with anger. It was as if they wanted to taunt him, to remind him of how easily they could have framed Brandon. Later that night, after Brandon had arrived safely at Aunt Sarah's house, Chief Thompson sat alone in his office, the packet of drugs and the note from the break-in sitting on his desk. He knew he had to move quickly and carefully. Brandon called to check in, and Chief Thompson reassured him. They tried to scare me, son, but they failed. You're safe, and I'm not stopping. I want you to focus on school. Try to relax. I'll keep you updated. Brandon agreed, but he could hear the tension in his father's voice, and he knew his dad was planning something big. The next day, Chief Thompson called an old friend, Special Agent Marcus Taylor from the FBI. If this corruption went as high up as he suspected, he'd need federal help to bring them down. Within hours, Agent Taylor had arranged to come to town, quietly but armed with resources to gather the proof they needed. I've heard about your situation, Agent Taylor said as he and Chief Thompson met in a secluded diner on the outskirts of town. And we're not taking this lightly. If these guys are staging arrests and threatening families, we'll make sure they pay for it. Chief Thompson nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. They're willing to target kids, innocent people. I won't let this go on any longer. Together, they began to map out a plan, going over the list of suspected officers. Chief Thompson provided every piece of evidence he'd gathered, hidden recordings, statements, everything he'd risked collecting over the past few weeks. They'd need to act quickly, methodically, to prevent the corrupt officers from covering their tracks. Over the next several days, Chief Thompson and Agent Taylor worked tirelessly, piecing together the information they needed to launch a full-scale investigation. Slowly, a pattern emerged, and soon, they had enough evidence to bring down the network. But they knew that this wouldn't be enough to keep Brandon and the others safe. They had to catch the main culprits in the act. One evening, after another long day of planning, Chief Thompson returned home to find a message on his answering machine. It was Brandon's voice, trembling but determined. "Dad, I know you're working hard to stop them, and I'm proud of you. I want you to be safe, too." The words hung in the air, filling Chief Thompson with a renewed sense of purpose. His son's bravery and trust were worth everything he was risking. But as he pressed play on the next message, a different voice filled the room. "You think you're winning, Thompson." It was the same smooth, cold voice that had threatened Brandon. "Well, let's see if you're willing to bet your son's life on it, because the next move I make will be one you'll never forget." The line went dead. Chief Thompson's heart raced, anger surging through him. He knew then that he'd have to take action sooner than planned, before it was too late. Chief Thompson felt his hand clench into a fist as the ominous threat echoed in his mind. He stared at the phone, replaying the voice over and over, committing every word to memory. This time, the threat wasn't vague. They were escalating, going after his son in a way that could no longer be ignored. He knew he needed to act fast. He dialed Agent Taylor's number, explaining the latest message with urgency. "We can't wait any longer," Chief Thompson said, his voice hard and controlled. "They've gone too far. If we don't make our move now, they're going to come after my family, and I won't risk my son's life." Agent Taylor's voice was calm but decisive. "Understood. I'm pulling in the resources we need. We'll meet at the safe house tonight to finalize the plan. And remember, Chief, we've got this. They'll have no place to hide when we're done." That evening, the small, unmarked safe house was filled with a quiet tension. Chief Thompson and Agent Taylor were joined by a few other federal agents and 2 trustworthy officers from Chief Thompson's team. Officers he knew had been on the right side of the law from the beginning. The room was dimly lit with a map of the town spread across the table and piles of evidence, photos, surveillance logs, and sworn statements, neatly organized in front of each team member. Agent Taylor cleared his throat, addressing the group. "All right, we've confirmed that the corrupt officers are not just staging arrests. They're involved in a larger operation with ties to local drug dealers. They've been planting evidence on people they want to silence, covering up crimes, and protecting their own. But now, we have enough to put them away for a long time." One of the officers, Officer Green, leaned forward, his face grim. "But they're not going down without a fight, are they? These people are willing to do anything to protect their operation." Agent Taylor nodded. "That's why we're hitting them where it hurts. Tomorrow, we're setting up a sting operation to catch them in the act. They think they're untouchable. But they're wrong." Chief Thompson's mind was racing with a mix of relief and fear. This plan could bring an end to everything they endured, but it was also risky, especially if his son's life was still in danger. As they finalized the details, Chief Thompson's phone buzzed. It was a text from Brandon. "Dad, I'm okay here. Aunt Sarah says hi. Don't worry about me. Just be careful." Chief Thompson's heart swelled with pride. Brandon was just a kid, but he'd handled all of this with incredible strength. He replied quickly, reassuring his son and promising he'd be safe. But deep down, he knew the promise was easier said than done. The next morning, Chief Thompson and Agent Taylor put the final pieces into place. They'd arranged for a fake drug deal to take place at a warehouse on the edge of town, one often used by the corrupt officers to conduct their under-the-table dealings. It was set up to look as real as possible, with undercover agents posing as buyers and sellers. As they prepared, Chief Thompson's mind drifted to Brandon. He kept reminding himself that this was for him, for the future he deserved, free from the corruption that had plagued their town. He couldn't wait for the day he could tell Brandon it was finally over. Hours later, the operation was in full swing. Chief Thompson watched from a hidden vantage point, his adrenaline pumping as he saw the familiar black SUVs pull up to the warehouse. He recognized a few of the faces as they got out, each one a reminder of the betrayal he felt discovering the corruption in his own department. "Showtime," Agent Taylor whispered, signaling the agents to prepare. They waited, watching as the officers began their transaction, discussing prices and protection fees. The conversation was being recorded, every word capturing the depths of their deceit. Finally, at Taylor's signal, the agents sprang into action, swarming the warehouse and surrounding the officers before they could escape. But just as they moved in, chaos erupted. One of the corrupt officers, realizing the setup, pulled a gun, aiming it at Agent Taylor. Another officer shoved a nearby agent, breaking free and sprinting toward one of the black SUVs, trying to escape. Chief Thompson's instincts kicked in. He dove after the fleeing officer, tackling him before he could reach the car. But as he did, he felt something sharp press against his side. A knife the officer had managed to pull from his belt. They struggled, each one fighting with everything they had. "Give it up," Chief Thompson growled, wrenching the knife from the officer's hand and pinning him to the ground. Nearby, Agent Taylor managed to subdue the other officer, disarming him and snapping the cuffs around his wrists. One by one, each of the corrupt officers was restrained, their hands bound as they were led away by the agents. The sting had worked. They'd caught every last one. As the officers were taken into custody, Chief Thompson finally allowed himself a moment of relief. It was over. The corrupt officers who had terrorized the town, threatened his son, and betrayed their oath were going to face justice. But as he walked toward Agent Taylor, his phone buzzed again. It was another message from an unknown number. "Nice try, Chief. But you missed one." Chief Thompson's stomach dropped. Had they made a mistake? Or was this a bluff? He looked over at Agent Taylor, who had noticed the alarm on his face. "What is it?" Taylor asked, glancing at the phone. Chief Thompson showed him the message, his mind racing. They'd been so careful, so thorough. But if there was still someone out there, someone who hadn't been caught. "It can be a scare tactic," Taylor said, though his expression was tense. "But just in case, we need to investigate further. There might be someone else involved that we haven't identified yet." Chief Thompson nodded, steeling himself. They couldn't afford to leave any stone unturned. Back at Aunt Sarah's house, Brandon was restless, checking his phone every few minutes for updates from his dad. He'd heard bits and pieces from the news, but the details were scarce, and the wait was agonizing. A knock on the door startled him, and he went to answer it, expecting to see Aunt Sarah. But instead, a man he didn't recognize stood there, his face partially hidden beneath a baseball cap. Brandon's instincts screamed at him to slam the door, but before he could react, the man pushed his way inside, grabbing Brandon by the arm. "Hello, Brandon," the man said, his voice smooth but menacing. "We're going for a little ride." Brandon struggled, trying to break free, but the man tightened his grip, pulling him toward a dark sedan parked outside. Just then, Aunt Sarah appeared in the hallway, her eyes widening in horror at the sight. "Hey, let him go," she shouted, rushing forward. The man's expression didn't change, but he pulled out a gun, aiming it at her. "Not a step closer," he warned, "or I'll make sure neither of you leaves this house." Brandon's heart pounded as he was shoved into the back seat of the car, the man slamming the door shut and locking it from the inside. He looked out the window, seeing Aunt Sarah standing frozen in the doorway, her face pale with fear. The car sped off, and Brandon's mind raced. He didn't know who this man was or where he was taking him. But he knew one thing. His dad was in danger, and now, so was he. Back at the warehouse, Chief Thompson's phone buzzed again, and this time, he answered immediately. "Chief Thompson," the voice said, cold and unfeeling. "Did you really think you could win? Who is this?" Chief Thompson demanded, his voice tense. "Oh, just someone who thinks it's time you understood the stakes. I've got your son, Chief, and if you want him back, you'll need to back off. Forget the charges. Let my associates go, and maybe, just maybe, you'll see your son again." Chief Thompson's blood ran cold. His worst fear had come true. Chief Thompson gripped his phone, feeling an icy dread seep into his bones. He had known this fight would be dangerous, that it would push his family to the edge, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Brandon was out there, in the hands of people who would do anything to protect themselves, and now his son's life hung in the balance. Agent Taylor noticed the pallor on Chief Thompson's face and stepped closer, concern etched in his gaze. "Chief, what happened? You're as white as a sheet." Chief Thompson took a shaky breath, his voice low and tense. "They've taken Brandon. The caller says they want us to drop the charges and release the officers we just arrested. If we don't, they'll hurt him." Agent Taylor's expression darkened. "We're not letting them get away with this, Thompson. They crossed the line, and we'll make sure they pay for it. But we need to act fast and carefully." Chief Thompson's hands trembled as he tried to steady himself. "I can't lose him, Taylor. Not my son." "And you won't," Agent Taylor assured him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "But we need a plan, and we need it now. If they want those officers released, it means they've got someone who still has access to a high level of communication and resources." Chief Thompson's mind raced. It was true. These people weren't simply local bullies. They were organized, influential, and had connections that reached beyond the town. Someone powerful was pulling the strings, and they were desperate enough to kidnap a police chief's son. Agent Taylor quickly set up a meeting with his team and began coordinating resources. They started tracking every recent call to Chief Thompson's phone, looking for any signal or clue that could lead them to Brandon's location. In the meantime, Chief Thompson reviewed the notes they had gathered, trying to find anything that might give him insight into who else was involved. Then, his phone buzzed again. "Thompson," the voice said, as calm as ever. "I hope you're listening closely." Chief Thompson swallowed hard, listening with every fiber of his being. "We've got your boy, and he's safe, for now. But if you think you can track us, you're wrong. Here's how this will work. You make sure those officers walk free by noon tomorrow, or your son will suffer the consequences. Don't test us, Chief. You have until then." Chief Thompson tried to keep his voice steady. "Let me talk to my son. I need to know he's all right." There was a pause, and then to his relief, he heard Brandon's voice, though it was shaky. "Dad." Brandon sounded scared, but he tried to keep calm. "I'm okay. They haven't hurt me." Chief Thompson closed his eyes, trying to stay calm for his son's sake. "Brandon, listen to me. You're going to be okay. I promise you that." Before he could say anything else, the kidnapper came back on the line. "You know the deal, Thompson. Noon tomorrow. Don't make us show you what happens if you disobey." The line clicked, and they were gone. As the call ended, Chief Thompson felt a mix of desperation and fury. The clock was ticking, and his son's life was hanging by a thread. He turned to Agent Taylor, who had overheard parts of the conversation, his face a mask of determination. "Did we get anything from that call?" Chief Thompson asked, his voice taut. Agent Taylor checked his phone, a slight smile breaking through his otherwise serious expression. "We did. It's a faint signal, but we pinpointed it to a location near the industrial district on the east side of town. It's a small window, but it's something." Relief flooded Chief Thompson's chest. "Let's go. We're not wasting another second." Brandon, meanwhile, sat quietly in the dimly lit room where he was being held. His heart was racing, but he tried to keep his breathing steady, just as his dad had taught him in times of stress. He could hear muffled voices from another room, two men, speaking in low tones that he couldn't quite make out. He took stock of his surroundings, looking for anything that might help him escape. The room was small and bare, with only a single wooden chair and a locked door. A single high window let in a thin strip of moonlight, casting shadows across the floor. Brandon's mind raced, thinking of the things his dad had taught him about staying calm and observing his surroundings. After what felt like an eternity, one of the men entered the room. He was tall, with sharp eyes and a cold expression, and he gave Brandon a look that sent a chill down his spine. "Your dad's quite the troublemaker, kid," the man sneered. "But if he plays by our rules, you'll be home safe soon enough." Brandon held his gaze, refusing to let the fear show. "You won't get away with this," he said, his voice steady. "My dad's going to stop you." The man laughed, an unsettling sound that echoed through the small room. "Your dad's only got a few hours to decide what's more important, keeping us behind bars or keeping you safe. Let's hope he makes the right choice." Outside, Chief Thompson and Agent Taylor arrived at the industrial district, a collection of abandoned warehouses and factories that hadn't been used in years. The faint signal they'd tracked pointed them to a specific building near the center of the complex. They moved in cautiously, weapons drawn, as they scanned the area for signs of movement. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the faint hum of the city in the distance. Chief Thompson's nerves were on edge, but his focus was razor sharp. He had to find Brandon. Nothing else mattered. As they approached the building, Taylor motioned for Chief Thompson to stay low and follow his lead. They had no idea how many men were inside or what traps might be waiting for them. The agents fanned out, securing the perimeter before entering through a side door. Inside, they found a dimly lit hallway with several doors leading off to various rooms. Chief Thompson listened intently, his ears straining for any sound that might indicate where his son was being held. Suddenly, he heard it, a faint shuffle, like someone moving around. He motioned for Taylor and the other agents to follow, and they moved down the hall, their footsteps silent. They reached a closed door at the end of the hall, and Chief Thompson recognized the voices from the other side. One was Brandon's, and the other belonged to the man who had spoken to him on the phone. He felt his anger flare, but he kept it under control, knowing he had to stay focused. With a signal from Taylor, they moved in, bursting through the door in a swift, coordinated motion. The man holding Brandon jumped, his face twisting into a look of shock, but he quickly pulled out a weapon, aiming it at the officers. "Back off, or the kid gets it," he shouted, his hand shaking as he held the gun to Brandon's head. Chief Thompson's heart pounded, but he kept his weapon trained on the man. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Let my son go, and I'll make sure you're treated fairly." The man laughed, his face contorted with a mix of fear and rage. "Fairly? Do you think I care about fairness? I'm not going back to prison. Not for you, not for anyone." Brandon, sensing the distraction, took a chance. He threw himself sideways, using his foot to kick the man's leg, throwing him off balance. The man stumbled, and in that split second, Chief Thompson seized the opportunity. He fired, aiming for the man's arm, and the gun flew from his grip as he cried out in pain. In seconds, Taylor and the other agents moved in, restraining him and securing the room. Chief Thompson rushed to Brandon, pulling him into a tight hug. Relief flooded him, overwhelming every other emotion. Brandon hugged him back, his own relief evident in his trembling hands. "Dad, I knew you'd come," Brandon whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Chief Thompson held him close, his voice thick. "I'll always come for you, Brandon. Always." Later, as the agents escorted the man out, Chief Thompson and Brandon walked outside, the night air cool against their faces. Agent Taylor joined them, a satisfied smile on his face. "It's over, Chief. You and Brandon are safe, and with this arrest, we'll have enough to bring down the rest of the network," Taylor said, clapping Chief Thompson on the back. Brandon looked up at his dad, a small smile breaking through his exhaustion. "Does this mean we don't have to look over our shoulders anymore?" Chief Thompson nodded, a sense of peace settling over him for the first time in weeks. "Yes, son. We're free now, and I'll make sure it stays that way." As they walked back to the car, Brandon glanced at his father, his respect and admiration shining in his eyes. "Dad, you really are a hero." Chief Thompson smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "I'm just a dad who loves his son, and that's all the reason I need." And as they drove away from the darkened warehouses, Brandon felt the weight of the past few days lifting, replaced by a sense of security he knew he'd never take for granted again. As the sun rose over the small town, Chief Thompson and Brandon sat together on the front porch, taking in the peaceful morning. After the whirlwind of the past few days, the stillness felt almost surreal. There was no need to look over their shoulders anymore, no lurking danger hiding in the shadows. They were finally free from the web of corruption that had nearly torn their lives apart. Chief Thompson sipped his coffee, glancing at Brandon, who was still half asleep but safe, right where he belonged. He couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. His son had been through an ordeal most kids his age couldn't imagine, but Brandon had faced it with bravery and resilience. The corrupt officers had been arrested, and the ring of deceit unraveled, one confession at a time. Agent Taylor had assured Chief Thompson that with the evidence and testimony they gathered, the case was as good as closed. The town's wounds would take time to heal, but the future was brighter than ever. For Brandon, the experience had transformed his understanding of his father's work. He'd always respected his dad, but now, he saw him as more than just a police chief. He was a protector, a man who fought for justice, no matter the cost. "Dad," Brandon said quietly, breaking the silence, "do you think things will ever go back to normal?" Chief Thompson looked at him, thinking carefully. "It may take a while, but yes, things will get better. People will remember this, and it'll make them stronger. It'll make our town stronger, and it'll remind us all why doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard." Brandon smiled, leaning against his dad's shoulder. "I'm just glad it's over." "So am I," Chief Thompson said, wrapping his arm around his son. "And I'm glad you're safe, kid. That's all that matters. In the weeks that followed, Chief Thompson was celebrated as a hero in the community, but all he cared about was being there for his family. His role as chief was secondary now. His focus was on rebuilding trust and ensuring that this darkness never returned. As for Brandon, he carried the strength he discovered through his ordeal, determined to live up to his father's example. Together, they'd endured a trial that would bond them forever, a testament to resilience, love, and the unwavering fight for justice. And as they sat together, watching the town slowly come alive with a new dawn, Chief Thompson knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together.